Murder for jewelry.
Not to say I was looking forward to this meeting, but it is yet another cross to bear in my profession. The victim of an unsolved crime that had been buried in our files for several years asked to meet with an investigator and, well, technically, that's where I come in. But with no witnesses to the crime itself and no additional evidence that had come to light in the years since the crime was committed, and it's doubtful they ever will. I feared then that this case would be one of many that would forever remain among our unsolved files. "Mr. Thomas, good morning. Please sit down," I said as the gentleman was ushered into my office. "Good morning, Sergeant," he replied formally, placing his briefcase on the floor beside him, and sat down in the chair I had indicated. "Well, sir, I understand you're wondering if we've made any progress on your case."
Yes. Well, I'm just mildly curious.
I looked at the unimpressively thin folder of papers lying on the desk in front of me. I had not been part of the original investigation team in my day, but in preparation for this meeting I had scrutinized the documents. I realized, however, that this would be a meeting between a helpless detective and a victim for whom he can do nothing. As far as I could tell, the investigators had in due course asked all the necessary questions and looked into all the right dark corners. The problem was that all I could tell him was literally, "There are no leads," a phrase I somewhat nearly uttered during the meeting. I decided it was best to summarize the case and what we had, and then let Peter Thomas ask all the questions he wanted. Only I doubted he'd come up with anything he hadn't already been asked many times. "For reasons we can't ascertain, and you, because of your injuries, can't remember," I added, casting a quick glance across the table at Thomas. "On the morning of Tuesday, April 14th, you left your office at about 10:30. We have no idea where you went or why. However, by 12:30 or so, you found yourself in the stairwell of the lower level of a downtown parking garage. Two ladies, by the way, their parking ticket was issued at 11:22, were entering the stairwell on level 5, we believe, at 11:30 when they heard what they correctly mistook for multiple gunshots. Frightened by these sounds, they ran back out to the 5th level and called the police on their cell phones. Officers arrived on the scene at 11:40, and you were quickly found lying on the stairwell between levels 1 and 2 with 3 bullet wounds, 1 to the head and 2 to the chest. Your wallet, watch, rings, car keys, and even change from your pockets had been stolen. No one saw your attacker or attackers or anyone else acting suspiciously in the parking lot before or after you were attacked. I'm sorry to say that, Mr. Thomas, but there was very little of interest there. I've read the file, and to be perfectly honest with you, sir, there were no witnesses, so we have nothing to go on." "So you've given up looking?" "Oh, no, sir, the case remains open. And if the gun, by the way, it was a .35 caliber automatic, probably what Americans like to call a Saturday night special, a cheap pocket pistol, not particularly powerful, and to that fact alone you probably owe your life. But if that gun is discovered or used again in another crime, well, then at least we'll have a place to start. These street robberies are tough nuts, Mr. Thomas. If the perpetrator regularly uses the same modus operandi, then there's a chance we can link several cases together and come up with something. Street robberies involving guns are rare in this country anyway. In your case, we suspect very strongly that the gun probably went off by mistake, and the criminal panicked when he realized he had hit you. If he had any common sense, he probably threw the gun in the river or something. But the case remains open in the archives." "So you've given up looking," he repeated. "Well, I don't see what else we can do besides what was done at the time, Mr. Thomas," I replied, looking at the open folder again. Then, for some reason, probably to remind myself of the dead end the investigators had reached, I flipped through a couple of pages. "Whenever a new investigator comes into the department, they go over all the available open cases with a fresh set of eyes. You know, I came to see you myself last year. We were hoping you might be able to recall some details of your movements that morning. But as you know, we looked into—" I quickly changed my mind and said the wrong thing. "We looked into everyone who might have a grudge against you, but there was nothing there. We even went so far as to contact insurance companies to see if there was... But the only major policy in your life wasn't of a suspicious nature. You'd only taken out too many years ago to cover your mortgage, and, well, The same standard policy I took out in my own life to take care of my family in case of anything unexpected. Sir, there was absolutely nothing the officers handling the case at the time could do. They were forced to conclude that it was just a random robbery. I am sorry, but I must admit that unless some further evidence comes to light to show that this is not the case, I very much doubt that the case will ever be solved. As I read the report carefully, I felt truly sorry for the man. The 3 wounds he received were serious, and if the weapon had been of a larger caliber, the one to the head would surely have been fatal. As it was, he remained in a coma on life support for 3 years, and doctors assured him that he would never come out of it. In fact, after 8 months and a court order, the life support machine was disconnected. But Peter Thomas surprised the quacks by continuing to breathe. However, they said that with so little brain activity. Well, the doctors thought he'd stay in a coma forever. And even if he did wake up, he probably wouldn't be much bigger than a cabbage patch. At one time, an attempt was made to obtain a court order, authorizing Peter Thomas to be disconnected from the life support machine, but this was denied. However, nowhere in the file did it say exactly who applied for the order, nor was there any indication of who or what organization objected to it. Unfortunately, from a police officer's perspective, there is rarely an aha moment in such a scenario. There are often a variety of people on both sides of the debate. Family members, doctors, and even hospital management, or to be more specific and hidden behind a lot of chatter, their accountants, and all can influence the decision to apply for such an order. After 2 years, even his family seemed to have lost hope that Peter Thomas would ever regain consciousness. While visiting her husband in the hospital, his wife apparently befriended a man named William Bowman. Bowman's wife was admitted to the same hospital with acute liver failure caused by excessive self-administration of para-acetaminophenol. This is routine paracetamol tablets for people like you and me, and the most common cause of liver failure in the UK and many other countries I can think of. Apparently it wasn't a suicide attempt or anything. By all accounts, Bowman's wife was a bit of a hypochondriac and, well, let's just say a little delicate mentally, and at the same time, she was a pretty vulnerable person. It was established, yes, the officers in the Thomas case were looking at every possibility, even at this late stage, that William Bowman's wife had overdosed on paracetamol by accident. There was nothing in the files to indicate exactly when the affair began between William Bowman and Mrs. Thomas, and there was no indication that William Bowman and Mrs. Thomas even knew of each other's existence before they encountered each other in the long-term care facility. However, after Bowman's wife passed away, he and Mrs. Thomas began to keep in touch. Bowman would often sit with Mrs. Thomas at her husband's bedside during her long vigils. Eventually, the inevitable happened. They fell in love. Mrs. Thomas divorced her husband and then married William Bowman. The officers on the Thomas case took another hard look at Bowman and Mrs. Thomas, but could find nothing to indicate that either of them knew the other existed until Mrs. Bowman was the first to go into liver failure. How do I know all this? Because it was all in Peter Thomas's file, only because we've officially ruled the attack on him a robbery. That's not to be taken as an implication that we've turned a blind eye to all other possible scenarios. It took another 18 months or almost 2 years before Mr. Thomas, against all medical advice, came out of his coma. After receiving this news, officers were at his bedside within hours. But to begin with, Peter Thomas suffered from acute amnesia and remembered very little of his adult life. Over the next few months, most of his memories gradually came back to him. I was glad I hadn't been involved with him on the case when he recalled his marriage in detail, and heck, he obviously knew his wife had divorced him while he was in a coma before he even remembered they were married. To inform him of this fact had the pleasure of Doc. But wasn't I glad I wasn't around during this disclosure? So you see, Mr. Thomas, unless a witness or some new evidence comes from somewhere, or you don't recover some memories of exactly what happened that particular morning, I'm sorry, but I highly doubt we'll ever make further progress on this case, and I was kind of hoping that's where the interview would end. But Peter Thomas had a strange look on his face that made me ask, "You didn't remember anything else, did you?" "No, but I think I've found some evidence." "Well, I suppose you could say that I actually found a witness." He smiled back at me, and then his expression turned grim. Peter Thomas picked up his briefcase and placed it on his lap. Opening it, he pulled out a framed photograph and held it out for me to look at. I was a little surprised to find that the picture was of his daughter and her husband on their wedding day. I even thought I remembered seeing it before when I had visited their home, familiarizing myself with Thomas's case. When taking on an unsolved case, standard procedure is to re-interview all possible witnesses just to make sure nothing was overlooked. Your daughter and her husband. I said so Peter Thomas would realize I recognized his daughter. A very beautiful young lady. Thank you. What do you think of the jewelry she's wearing? Expensive genuine diamonds, isn't it? Yes, my wife's. At least 50 grand at today's prices. Impressive. I hope they're in a safe place? I had a second safe hidden in my house to keep them in. I bought the pendant for my wife on our 5th wedding anniversary. Lucky girl. My wife would kill for a pendant like that. Mr. Thomas had that strange expression on his face again. For our 10th anniversary, I ordered matching earrings. Very impressive. They must have cost a fortune. Yes, they did, but not as much as the necklace I had made for our 15th anniversary. The tiara that my daughter is wearing is actually a necklace attached to a wire frame. When worn as a necklace, a pendant can be attached to it with a small clip, or, as you can see, the pendant can be worn separately on a separate chain. Very easy to attach, and it must have been made by an experienced craftsman, I commented. Surely the little man who has a workshop on Monk Street. Coleman, do you know him? I've heard of him, Mr. Thomas, but with my salary my wife will hardly ever find any of his things in her jewelry box, I said with a smile. Quite understandably, and I'm sorry. In any case, those pieces of jewelry my daughter is wearing are my witnesses. I beg your pardon? I had no idea what Peter Thomas meant. Well, you see, Sergeant, my wife lent this piece of jewelry to our daughter so she could wear it on her wedding day. As you know, I've settled down pretty well over the years, and my wife had plenty of other jewelry she could wear, but still couldn't outshine the bride on her wedding day. Could she? I nodded in agreement with Peter Thomas, though I had no idea where he was taking me. Sometimes it's best to let people tell things their own way. Unfortunately, before returning the jewelry, my daughter must have tried to hook the pendant back onto the necklace and slightly damaged the clip that secures it. I noticed this when I picked up the set to take a look. You know, our 20th anniversary was coming up, and I guess I was wondering if Coleman could add anything else to the set. A silly idea, really. The whole ensemble is too pretentious as it is. There weren't many instances where my wife got away with it, although Lydia likes him. No, there's no need to multiply envy. I'm sorry, sir, but I really don't see where you're going with this, I finally had to admit. Oh no, I'm sorry, Sergeant. I haven't shown you this photograph yet. Peter Thomas took a second framed photograph out of his briefcase and handed it to me. I knew immediately that it was a picture of his ex-wife and William Bowman on their wedding day. What's more, she was wearing the same jewelry as her daughter in the first picture, except for the pendant that was dangling from her necklace. You know that since coming out of the hospital, I've been living on the South Coast. I rarely come into town these days and therefore don't get to my daughter's house very often. She usually comes to see me with her husband and kids about once a month or so. But a few months ago, they bought a new and much larger house. I had a reason to come into town to see my attorney to update my will, so I took the opportunity to visit them unannounced. The reason I was at my daughter's house doesn't really matter. What matters is that my daughter was not expecting my arrival, and therefore, as usual, did not put away that picture of Lydia and her new husband as she always did before my previous visits. My daughter was a diplomat and knew that seeing a picture of Lydia with him would probably upset me. Peter Thomas suddenly fell silent and for a while looked silently at the photograph of the smiling faces of his wife and Bowman. It's very pretty, isn't it, Sergeant? I had to agree with him. But unfortunately also rather vain, and perhaps that will lead to her downfall. Excuse me, Mr. Thomas? The necklace, Sergeant. There's a pendant attached to it in this photograph. I told you the clip was broken. Come in, Mrs. Tom. I'm sorry, Mrs. Bowman, isn't it? Have a seat, please. Sergeant, why was I so rudely summoned here like this? Your officers needlessly embarrassed me in my workplace, she replied, clearly annoyed. I apologize, Mrs. Bowman, but certain evidence of an attempt on your first husband's life has recently come to light. She was good. I give her credit. However, there was no mistaking the momentary flash of apprehension that flashed across the lady's face before she shot back at me. "What are you talking about?" "Peter was accidentally shot by a burglar," the officers assured me at the time. "Based on the evidence they had at the time, that was the most likely scenario, Mrs. Bowman. However, you never know when known evidence, or even a sudden new witness, will lead us in a different direction. Or someone has been considered in the past, even several times, but we didn't realize their significance," I replied. "I don't understand." "I'm sure you will understand very soon, Mrs. Bowman." I reached over and pressed the start button on the recorder. Then out loud for the record, I identified myself and the male officer sitting next to me, taking notes, and the time and date, then asked Mrs. Bowman to introduce herself to the microphone. I must say that, in a matter of moments, she went from a very belligerent woman to a rather anxious one. Once the formalities were over, I showed Mrs. Bowman a copy of a photograph of her with her second husband on her wedding day, and asked her to confirm that this was, in fact, the case. "Yes, of course it was. What does all this mean, Sergeant?" she replied. "Just some unfinished business that has caused us some confusion recently, Mrs. Bowman. That's what I have to clear up now, that's all. Now, am I correct in assuming that all the jewelry you're wearing in this picture was bought by your first husband?" "Yes, for different wedding anniversaries." "Hey, and that these are the same jewelry that your daughter is wearing here in this picture?" I showed Mrs. Bowman a copy of another photograph that Mr. Thomas had supplied us with. "Yes, that's right," she assured me. "Tell me, Mrs. Bowman, did you happen to have any reason to wear any of this jewelry during the 3 months between your daughter's wedding and the time Mr. Thomas was shot?" "No, my daughter returned them, and they were put back in my jewelry safe. Peter installed the safe. He was paranoid that we might get robbed one night when we weren't there." "Did you wear it at all between your daughter's wedding and yours to William Bowman?" "Well, yeah, after the divorce. I hardly went anywhere while my husband was in the hospital. I may have worn the pendant and earrings a few times when William and I dated after the divorce. But the first time I wore the whole set was at our wedding. I really don't see where you're going with these questions, Sergeant." "Well, you see, Mrs. Bowman, I have a problem. I've looked through the documents several times, and nowhere does it mention that your husband had a case of this jewelry with him or anywhere near it when he was found lying on those stairs that day. But it has come to my attention that just after 11 o'clock in the morning, Peter Thomas took the necklace and pendant from Coleman's jeweler on Monk Street, the man who originally made it. Apparently, your daughter had damaged the clasp or something, and Peter Thomas had taken the necklace to Coleman's store for repair a few days before the incident. Mr. Coleman is a very diligent businessman, Mrs. Bowman, especially when it comes to 30,000 pounds sterling worth of diamonds. There is a copy of the receipt in his files, time and date stamped. The question I must ask you, Mrs. Bowman, is, how did you come to own these jewels again? It is believed that Mr. Thomas had the briefcase he was carrying the morning he was attacked. One of Coleman's assistants distinctly remembers Mr. Thomas placing the jewels in the briefcase and locking it. However, there is no record of a briefcase being found at the scene. Apparently, the perpetrator stole whatever valuables your ex-husband had with him that day. So, Mrs. Bowman, could you explain how some of the contents of Peter Thomas's briefcase came into your possession?" Mrs. Bowman turned very pale and remained silent. I didn't expect her to break down completely and confess everything, but I had a feeling that if I pushed a little harder, she might. Although there is always the danger that I will push, and she will, as Americans like to put it, pounce on me with a lawyer. Still, I had little hard evidence for me to hope the woman would crack. So, I opted for the murder charge. "Lydia Bowman, I'm arresting you for the attempted murder of your husband, Peter Henry Thomas. You have the right to say nothing, but it may prejudice your defense if you fail to mention anything you later rely on in court. Anything you say could be used against you. In fact, I highly doubted that Lydia pulled the trigger herself. Accusing her of a crime was a risky ploy, but I thought it might work. I got lucky, and Lydia cracked almost instantly. No, I didn't shoot him, it was... It was who, Lydia? William Bowman? I suggested. Yes, it was William's idea. I think he killed his wife as well. I hadn't expected the implication that Bowman might have killed his wife, but logically it made sense. I see. But to make it look like a robbery, he had to take the briefcase, and only later did you discover that your diamonds were also in it. Yes, I had no idea that Peter had taken them with him or why. Neither of you knew that Peter had gone jewelry shopping that morning, did you? You didn't even know that your daughter had damaged the clasp. Peter thought he'd sneak it in for repair so you wouldn't even realize your daughter had damaged it. No. Bill found the jewelry box later when he went to put a brick in the briefcase for heaviness. He was going to throw it in the river. And he couldn't bring himself to throw away 30,000 pounds. I wouldn't have let him. Do you know what William Bowman did with the gun? No, I have no idea, although what, Lydia? Bill has a storage unit somewhere. The apartment's not registered in his name, and he pays rent in cash. I have no idea what he keeps in there. Whether we'll find the gun in that storage unit is anyone's guess. But I'm pretty sure we'll still get a conviction on Mrs. Bowman's second confession. Life goes on. The end.